After all these great graphics, we'll introduce our talk. Simplicity is everything. When we heard the word shock, I was like, well, this is great. You could do just about anything with shock, but it's a good time for us to be talking about shock. And so we're going to do what we've never done before, a kind of conversation here.
We never speak to each other.
And kind of leap right into the topic. For me, when I heard it was shock, the only thing I could think of was shock theater. This was like the most outrageous part of my childhood. You had to sneak to be able to stay up and watch these horror movies that someone told my mother, if the kids watch these, they'll never sleep, they'll be warped, blah, 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 blah. And it was like, honestly, you'd stay up and watch them. You kept waiting for the part to get shocking. It really never did. But honestly, then to look at what is shocking, a kind of Tesla experiment. And we went back and we looked at, well, what are we talking about when we say shock or shocking? We're talking about kind of a definition of shocking. It's a jolt, it's a surprise, it's a collision, it's a physical charge. It could have a physical impact on you. It's so surprising. It could be a new idea. It could be an experiment. And for both of us who started out in the worlds we live in today, in contemporary art museums, or contemporary art and museums, that's really what it's supposed to be about. I mean, new art, contemporary art, is supposed to be something new. It's supposed to be something not comfortable. It's supposed to sort of grab you and shake you up and make you think about all the things that you took for granted before. So you want to be shocked. I think that's why we seek out the art of the new. So we thought we'd go back about 150 years to what truly was shocking. The Monet's Olympia from 1863. This work was greeted with such scorn and derision. There were fist fights outside the exhibit over this painting. It's funny to think about that because the painting is so much like this painting of Venus by Titian from 1538. So 300 years later, this is a shocking thing to see the update of this work of art. Another really shocking work of art, which at least for me was a little bit shocking in an art history class where maybe you were a freshman and you took things literally and thought, what's she doing and what are they doing and how did this all work out? This is from the same year. So pretty shocking. And the last time I was shocked by this painting was when we went on a public art tour to the, it's the Trenton Grounds for Sculpture.
Yeah.
And this really was shocking that they had made a bronze, J. Seward Johnson had made a bronze of all the elements in this painting and colored them. This was shocking to us. So all that by way of saying that what is shocking to one person for one reason may be equally shocking to someone else for a very different reason. And then after looking at those nudes, we, of course, have to look at Picasso's really shocking, life-changing, art-changing, almost history-changing painting of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And, bringing in elements of African sculpture, a painting of prostitutes from Avignon, just shock. I think we can still sort of appreciate how this painting was shocking. But on we go. So we're going to talk about some shocking things and the reaction that people have to them. And we're going to start with our topic, which is, our subtitle is, You Can't Do That. You just can't do that. And there's a different reason every time it gets said to us. So take it away.
Take it away. Is this on? Oh, okay, thanks. Well, it's my 25th anniversary, not my wedding anniversary, but the 25th anniversary of being on trial for showing the work of Robert Mapplethorpe. And literally the 25th anniversary was 1990, which is a long time ago. And in 1990, this is what shocked America, okay? The work of a photographer. Some people dismissed him as just a fashion photographer. But he was a photographer that also dealt with some pretty tough topics about homosexuality and S&M and racial issues, and did classic and wonderful nudes. They organized a show at the University of Pennsylvania, a very shocking institution, and organized a show that was to travel around America, to go to Chicago and to Hartford and to Berkeley and to my wonderful institution in Cincinnati, Ohio. And when we agreed to take this show, it was kind of our norm because we were used to showing work that was confrontational, that did perhaps shock some people, but that really kind of made you think about a lot of issues. And so we were not very concerned about this exhibition until about a year later. And a year later, I was sitting in a conference of museum directors in Providence, Rhode Island. And in walked the head of our association, who promptly announced that he had some shocking news for all of us, some terrible news for all of us, that the Corcoran Gallery, which is a fine old institution in Washington, D.C., had decided not to show the work of Robert Mapplethorpe for fear of the political reprisals that would happen in Congress if they showed this work. So they literally did not do the show. And there were artist protests and finally wound up in an alternative space, much like spaces in Washington. But as I was sitting there in that room, a friend of mine from San Diego, another museum director, said, "Do you know anybody who's taking that show?" And I said, "I am." He said, "You are so screwed." He actually said it a little more shockingly than that. So let's go on to being screwed here. There I am, being arrested. No, I show this because it actually was quite a moment. And what happens at what time and what happens 20 years later. Mapplethorpe might not have been a big issue here in Cleveland or in some other places, certainly not in Berkeley. But in a city like Cincinnati, it became an issue where they focused on the issues of homosexuality and obscenity. And Cincinnati had a reputation for being kind of truly conservative in these areas, although our institution had been there for 50 years and had shown this work like this over and over again. So we were indicted. And after a long PR battle and a battle in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, so we were indicted. I was indicted for obscenity. The museum was indicted for obscenity. And it caused quite a commotion in our community. This is just one of the moments in sort of a year-long battle that tore that city apart over the issues of what you can show and not show in a museum. And there were that's outside the courthouse. I think I'm inside the courthouse at that point. But I mean, a really kind of amazing thing. And in the end, I don't know what slide's coming up next year.
This one.
In the end, I was acquitted. That's my attorney, Lou Sirkin. And I talk about acquitting and about shock. Again, for the average Cincinnatian, whatever an average Cincinnatian is, this work probably would have been difficult. For our audience, which would be an audience very used to being in museums and galleries and looking at work that was provocative, it was not. But for somebody who didn't go to museums, it was. And it was interesting that the jurors, we had a jury trial, the jurors who had never been to the Contemporary Art Center, if they had been to the Contemporary Art Center, they were excluded in the pretrial, were not shocked by this. And more importantly than that, they were very angry about the fact that they were precluded, or they were not allowed to see this because the authorities would not let them see this. And the whole idea of who decides and who controls was a big issue with Mapplethorpe. All right, moving on. Here I am with Jimmy Woods. We look so much alike. But the interesting thing is Mapplethorpe became a kind of phenomenon, and it became a movie. Mapplethorpe the movie. There's Mapplethorpe behind us, and Jimmy played me. And it was kind of fun. It was aptly titled Dirty Pictures. You can still get it on Netflix.
Or in the back.
Or the back. And I do not get any royalties. All right. And again, here we are together. I mean, it was interesting about the film, and we'll go on from there, that originally HBO was going to make the movie in 1990. And they found the images too shocking for television. Do you find? I find that humorous right now. So it took until 2000 when Showtime agreed to show all of the images, albeit very briefly, for which we were indicted.
And Jimmy won a Golden Globe
for playing
Dennis. That was shocking.
All right. That's Kathy in the bathtub. All right, you can't do that. Okay, so the Mapplethorpe controversy ended my art career, but it didn't end my career in museums. And I came to Cleveland in 1993 to do a museum about rock and roll. And as we have here in the title, you can't make a museum about rock and roll. There was so much criticism, and there are people involved with the project in the room today, but there was so much criticism about the idea that you could do a museum about music. How could you put music in a museum? And that rock and roll, it was hardly worth doing a museum about the history of rock and roll. It was not of any real value to our society. Well, I think we proved them wrong. And for me personally, it was a project that I really, really wanted to do, not just because I loved the music, because I thought the music was so important and so challenging. And when you really think about rock and roll, and you think about what it says and what it's always said over the years and how it morphs today, it's always been about challenging society and the term sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And it's a very real part of what the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame did. It was interesting that a lot of people connected with the project were unsure about how far we should go with the content of the project. And I remember we made all these rather incredible films. And I was sitting in one of the films where some of the interviews with Bono and Pete Townsend and others were quite explicit about and used quite explicit language in terms of their relationships, their affairs, their drug use, their sex lives, and so forth. And I was sitting there with one of our trustees. It was a little preview that the staff had. And I could feel him. I could literally feel him getting more nervous as we watched the film. And finally, when the film was over, I thought, I'm fired. Because this thing is just too explicit. And he stood up. He didn't even know what to say to me. And at that point, out of the audience, it was a staff audience, a little smaller than here, out walked a nun who had been volunteering at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And she came up to us and she literally said, Mr. Barrie, that film has changed my life. And I said to the trustee, see, if the Catholic Church can accept this film, we certainly can. So you all know the history of the Rock Hall. It's been an amazing success, 10 million visitors. I don't think anybody questions the idea anymore that you could put popular music in a museum. It's led to a trend of popular culture museums. It's led to blues museums and jazz museums and Grammy museums. And again, had a tremendous impact on the city to the point where the city is identified with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Which leads to our next seamless segue. You can't make a museum about spying. So we had this idea, Dennis, Milt Maltz, and eventually me, of doing a series of museums in different cities that sort of picked up on the culture of the city and could present some unique aspect of that city. I was hired for this mysterious project that Dennis couldn't even tell me what it was. So finally, as we're in this conversation, I said, you've got to give me a little bit more. So he said, go stand by the fax machine. And the first sheet through the fax machine said, the International Spy Museum. And I sort of laughed that he had me at the or international, but by the time we got to the word spying, I was so sold. So you can imagine the discussion about this. First of all, people from Cleveland, of all places, coming into Washington to build a new museum, to do a for-profit museum in a city of free museums. Those are free museums that we all pay for. And on a topic that is top secret, cannot be discussed, and would be detrimental to democracy. So we said, gee, there's a lot you can't say, but in between there are some things you can say. And it really is in the interest of every country to know as much as people can about the world around them, and to get unvarnished truth about what's going on in the world around them. We started the development of the museum in 2000. We were working in our designers' offices near the White House on September 11th of 2001. And the topic in front of us on our desks, the topic we were really going to go into depth on that day, said, Pearl Harbor, greatest intelligence failure. That's what's sitting on the desk. And we sat in that room and watched the world change. And we all took our mission to do a spying museum very seriously. And we took it even more seriously after that. And I'm thrilled when people come up to me and say, oh, my kids loved your museum. And I think, well, that's great. But did you really look at these topics? Because there was a lot there that we didn't know when we first started into the topic. And people said to us, well, you can't do that topic. You just can't do it. And by the end of, maybe 6 months into the development of the museum, we had 3 former directors of the CIA, former director of the FBI, the heads of technical ops, heads of intelligence for the Navy, the Army, and the National Security Agency, all on the board of the museum advising us. Now, you think that would be great until you would say to them in a breakout session, we're going to do an exhibit on spy capitals of the world. And they'd say, oh, that's great, do it. So we'd say, okay, what spy capitals of the world should we do? And they'd say, we can't tell you that. So we'd say, well, we're going to read you a list. Could you blink or something if it's a good idea? But on we plowed, and people were also, from the outside, very concerned that we weren't going to be able to approach certain topics. They said, how are you going to do this spy? The U.S. government isn't always completely clean on these things. We said, really? There are some spy operations and historical moments, the Rosenbergs, the Cold War, you name it. How are you going to deal with that topic? We said, we're just going to tell the truth. We don't have an axe to grind, and we're not going to do a whitewash. And that is pretty much the way we've approached any time that a really hot topic comes out. We did a focus group, as we often do with museums, to see if things were resonating with, is that okay? Okay, good.
Feedback.
With the way we were telling the story, and we had a group of about 12, and it reminded me so much of the movie 12 Angry Men, because all it took was one guy in that focus group to say, it's a CIA plot. And people who had been giving us really great information started going, oh, I don't know if you can do that. That's not going to be accurate, that kind of thing. So it had its moments. It opened to, great applause. There were lines around the block for, I am embarrassed to say this boastingly, 8 months, because we didn't have the ticketing down. Even still, it's pretty great to go there and see lines outside, and they still are drawing 700,000 visitors a year, and the tickets are $25. So in a city of free museums, pretty good. This is the exhibit on the Cold War, and we just had so much fun artistically. We employed a lot of artists in this, thematic artists. Don Harvey did a piece, Luis Jimenez did a piece. We tried to get as many, kind of artistic little wonderful touches in the museum as possible. Our next topic was we were invited by the mayor of Las Vegas to come and talk to him about doing a mob museum in Las Vegas. And that was pretty interesting because the media was, and this was to be a city-sponsored project, and the media was all over him because he, Oscar Goodman, was a former mob defense, or as he would say, so-called mob defense attorney. And he got so much grief that he started calling it the MOP Museum. So it became known. He'd get up in the media and talk about the MOP, M-O-P Museum. It was great fun.
So I think an interesting thing about it, you can't do that. There always are lots of factors with the spy museum, the topic, and getting into secrets and being a mouthpiece for the CIA, all of which we were not. We did get into secrets. But in Las Vegas, of all places, Oscar was a mob attorney. That's Oscar on the right with...
Robert De Niro. With Tony Spilatro.
But he's also with Tony Spilatro over there, one of his defendants. But Oscar, it was very interesting to look at. You think of Las Vegas and you think of like the loosest place in the Western world, right? And you think about... just anything goes, right? What happens in Las Vegas. But the good citizens of Las Vegas, many of them were quite ashamed of their history or afraid of their history and afraid about talking about the fact that the mob really did control Las Vegas for quite a long time, for about 40 years. And that the casinos that we all know so well today were mob developed or mob controlled, and they didn't want to do with this history. And Oscar, to his credit, as a strong mayor, said, this is our history. And sometimes we get that in the projects we do, the fear of telling the truth. And actually the truth comes out, and it's a fabulous story. I mean, the story of Vegas is fascinating, whether it's told in Scorsese's Casino or in the real-life activities of what happened to the mob in
Vegas. And I think the part that really strengthened it for us was, if you're going to do an interesting museum on a historical theme, there's got to be some tension. There's got to be, the forces of good and evil lined up and all the gray stuff in between. And the story of law enforcement, the Department of Justice, FBI, people writing bills like the RICO Act to figure out how to take down these criminal enterprises, were really significant. And although, you sort of start with these unbelievably violent acts that we associate with the mob, you then get to the kind of wily schemes of organized crime. Then you get to all the efforts of law enforcement to take them down and the bravery to go undercover and get some of this information. And so in the end, the museum really is about both things. And we had marvelous people, and I just always have to put in the slide on the right and the person in the center who is Judge Donna Congeni Fitzsimmons, who truly is one of the stars of our show. She was on the task force prosecuting the Cleveland mob in the 80s. They successfully took down the Cleveland mob. This was all around the time of Danny Green and the sort of deconstruction of the Cleveland mob. She was a woman in her early 30s. There were death threats against her. There were FBI agents in Cleveland who were moved along with their families out of town. And, very quickly you get to the point that if someone has a misconception that a mob museum is going to be about those colorful characters, who brought you Prohibition, you're pretty quickly set on the right stage. The most shocking thing to me was going to go to the University of Notre Dame to do an interview with a man named Bob Blakey. And he is sitting right there. He was the staff attorney to the House Committee on Assassinations. This is the committee headed by our former Congressman Lou Stokes. They were looking into the assassinations of President Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. But the thing that was so shocking sitting in his house was this photo of Lou Stokes sitting next to Fidel Castro. That was my biggest shock. Just shocking that they had gone down to Havana to do the interviews, because there was a lot of information that the CIA was working with organized crime on plots to assassinate Castro, and they stonewalled and didn't reveal that during the Warren Commission hearings. So Blakey et al. Go back in and reinvestigate what's going on. And out of that committee came the theory, debunked by many, but not by the people involved with it, that there was more than one shooter, and that was the whole grassy knoll thing. So, in the course of doing these museums, we have found out just amazing things about the world we live in that we didn't know and that we like to be able to get into. So here we are. What's shocking today? Maybe we need a little bit more of a shock.
You'll offend. Yeah, I'll jump in. It is interesting because, as Kathy said, we sort of, when we do these museums, we just say, okay, this is what we've found out. You can decide for yourself, but this is, and in many cases, the things are very controversial about who did kill John F. Kennedy. But what we find out today that, and we put up there, you'll offend somebody. I guess it's very interesting for us that there's so much caution in the museum world about what you will and will not show, about what you will and will not say, about political correctness, about what you cannot say. It was interesting, in the wake of Mapplethorpe, which was 1990, there was like a 10-year period where every American museum was afraid to do anything shocking and to show anything that was really controversial. I mean, the work, if you look at that period, it really was like, snoozeville. And that's not to say that everybody should go out and do another Robert Mapplethorpe show. I don't think we're advocating that. But we are advocating that you do talk about issues in your society. And so lately we found out that if you talk about issues in your society, you offend somebody. And so therefore, you can't talk about that issue, or they want you to tone it down.
So we were trying to think of what was shocking. And, there is so much shocking footage on our newscasts. There's so much shocking news from around the world, whether it's ISIS or destroying cultural antiquity, the plight of refugees. I mean, there's plenty to be shocked about. And then you get to something like this episode that's going on at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where accompanying an Impressionist painting show, they had Kimono Wednesdays. And so on Kimono Wednesdays, you could go in, try on a kimono, pose in front of the painting on the right, and there was this huge protest about cultural imperialism and et cetera, et cetera. And this image shows a young Japanese-American teacher from Boston who was protesting the protest because he loved bringing his students in and getting this kind of first-hand thing. And on the left is Kimono Day in San Francisco. So it's just like, when there's a protest, why is there the protest and what's it really about? Is it about poking somebody? Is it really about power and authority? What is it about? We were reading some pieces about this and came across an article by Neil Harris, who's a professor at the University of Chicago. And he said, just briefly to quote him, "Is it possible in our society for museums deliberately to avoid all controversy in their choice of exhibitions? If they could, would it be wise for them to do so? Any institution concerned with historical interpretation that deliberately and conspicuously avoids provocation will itself become a subject for criticism. Controversy should be neither a criterion for producing a specific exhibition nor a bar to it. There are other reasons for deciding to mount or not to mount a show." So we could go to the upcoming show at LACMA
Okay.
which is the, okay,
Go ahead.
XYZ portfolio, part of the show at the CAC, or the events of 2 weeks ago.
All right. So, 2 weeks ago, I was called by a reporter from the New York Times. And the issue was the fact that Robert Mapplethorpe's photograph, the man in the polyester suit, was about to go out on auction at Sotheby's. And there are only a few issues of these, a few copies of this in private hands. And he asked me, did I think that this would still shock people? And I said, yes. And he said, well, I kind of agree, but why do you say that? And I said, because it's blatant sexuality, because here's a fully dressed man, except his penis is hanging out. It's a black penis, so it's also about sex and race. And I said, I really think that this will still be an issue. And it's funny, when we had the Mapplethorpe show, we were indicted for 7 photos. This was not one of them. But the conservative columnist, William F. Buckley, came to see the show. And some of you don't even know who Buckley is or was. But nevertheless, he was quite a force before, like the Rush Limbaughs of today. And he had written 2 columns about the exhibition, pretty damning of the exhibition. And he came to see the show, and he said, well, it's a really beautiful show except for the man in the polyester suit. This one really, really bothered him. And again, I think for all the reasons we talk about, sex and race. So this goes on auction. It goes on auction at Sotheby's 2 weeks ago, sells for $480,000. And as you can see, this is the image from the Sotheby's catalog. They have blocked out the important part, folks. And this was just incredulous when we saw this. And so what Kathy is alluding to is that Robert Mapplethorpe, the work of Mapplethorpe in March of 2016 will be shown, the first joint show of the Getty Museum and the Los Angeles County Museum in Los Angeles. Will be a joint retrospective of Mapplethorpe's work. There also will be a made-for-HBO 2-hour special on the life of Robert Mapplethorpe and his work. I'll be curious if they show this. But it just goes to show that, we go through periods of, where things do shock us, do bother us. And this is 20 years later, it comes back as an issue that confronts us literally in the face, so to speak. But the idea that some things, kind of recur in our society and are still with us, that you can't do that.
And so next Friday, there is a symposium in Cincinnati on the exhibit and the aftermath, and the timing is quite interesting to be asked to talk about shock here today. So there's no final slide, just a final thought. One of the artists who's involved in this show in Cincinnati, there's an accompanying exhibit that's going on, and she called Dennis and she said, I am doing some photographs for this show, and I would like very much if you would pose for me. And he said, oh. And then she said, in the nude. And he said, no. Thank you, Dennis. And she wasn't very happy with him.
I said at age 68, I don't do much in the nude anymore.
So we're leaving you with too much information, but that's our final shot.
That's our final shot. Thank you.